Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the Central Asia in Focus newsletter. Turkmenistan has been on an unprecedented campaign to sell its natural gas recently. Turkmenistan has the fourth largest reserves of natural gas in the world, but after more than 30 years of independence, the country has only one real customer, China. Small volumes go to Russia and even smaller volumes to Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan, but the amount of gas Turkmenistan exports is far from its potential. So, who are the potential customers Turkmenistan is targeting, and what's behind the sudden burst of advertising? To discuss all this, I am joined by John Roberts, who, as an energy expert, works with a number of governmental and private organizations, but I'm just going to mention that he is an energy security specialist with Methinks Limited, a consultancy specializing in interrelationship between energy, economic development, and politics, and is an advisor to the Trans-Caspian Resources Incorporated, a U.S. company seeking to develop a connector pipeline between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. And we have Farruh Yusupov, who is the director of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Turkmen service, known locally as Azatlyk. Thank you both for joining me. And Farruh, I'd like to start with you. Which countries is Turkmenistan looking at as potential gas buyer?
Turkmenistan now is positioning itself as a potential gas supplier to everyone, to Turkey, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Iran, Russia, China, Uzbekistan, and recently Kazakhstan. But the question is, who is ready to buy Turkmenistan's gas, and who sees Turkmenistan as a reliable gas supplier? Because other than its gas trade with China, Turkmenistan did have issues with other importers of its gas, like with Iran. They had issues recently in the past several years. With Russia, they had issues in the past. So, who will want to buy? That remains to be a big question.
Okay, thanks, John. Can you give us the basics on Turkmenistan's gas situation? I mean, how much gas does it have? And, I'd mentioned its customers, but can you put that into perspective and tell us how much they're shipping to these people?
Well, the most important thing is that Turkmenistan has the world's largest onshore gas field, Kurdish, which is developing, but we're not sure why it is developing it. That may sound a slightly peculiar thing to say, but at the moment, because they've only got one customer, one big customer. That customer is China. And although we're seeing some growth in exports to China, it is nothing like as fast as one might have expected. And at least half of the stuff that goes to China is actually produced by a completely separate Chinese concessionary area in the north of the country. So this giant gas field is basically serving Turkmenistan itself in as much as anything. And yet, it ought to be, as was originally planned, serving Pakistan and India, as they have talked about, having a great big swap with Iran, 10 BCM going south, with Iraq, going south through Iran. And logically, it should be used to supply in every direction because it's got the physical reserve capability to supply major markets as far afield as Europe, Iraq, China, and indeed, should Russia ever want it, Russia. But the biggest thing perhaps we ought to think about is, why is so little Turkmen gas going to its immediate neighbors, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, which are currently gas short?
Okay, thank you. Farruh, I'd like to ask you about Russian-Turkmen gas relations. You just mentioned this, and John mentioned it too. There was a day, admittedly more than 15, 16 years ago, when Turkmenistan had its gas exports to Russia up to pretty close to 40 billion cubic meters a year. What's happened since then?
Since then, Russian invasion to Ukraine happened, and sanctions happened, and now Russia is still buying some Turkmen gas, but because it wants to appease Turkmenistan as it's getting more and more isolated. But it's showing its interest to supply gas backwards. They have been talking about this gas union with Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and then despite Turkmenistan's resistance to join that union, Russia was insisting that Turkmenistan should join, and maybe Russia even wanted to put its gas to Turkmenistan-China gas pipeline. So now Russia wants to use those gas transportation systems to sell its gas. So at the moment, I mean, probably John would know it better, of course, but probably in the near or even midterm, Russia will not be the buyer of Turkmen or any Central Asian gas.
I think there's also something that is quite unexpected. I think Russia is actually freezing out Turkmen gas from the local Central Asian market. It's doing this both in the physical sense, that it's Russian gas going into Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and in the cash sense. It's charging relatively low prices to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Now, perhaps the most important element here is Uzbekistan. Go back 15 years ago. Uzbekistan had about 10 BCM spare capacity in terms of production over consumption. And it had a big Russian company, Lukoil, that was putting in a $5.5 billion program that was going to expand gas exports by 10 BCM. All of this expected to result in exports. But look at the situation today. Domestic production in Uzbekistan has collapsed. Domestic consumption has risen, not very much, but just enough to be more than production. So in other words, they're not merely having to import to survive, but they've lost their classic exports. So when they talk about increasing Russian exports from around 2 or 3 BCM a year to perhaps 11 BCM a year, what are they really talking about? I think they're really talking about finding a means of being able to continue to put gas into the Central Asia-China pipeline system. In other words, we're seeing a swap deal. Russian gas to Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan gas to China. And they may be trying to do the same with Kazakhstan, the Russians. So in other words, we are seeing Turkmenistan frozen out not only of the Central Asian market, but the pipeline to China being taken up to capacity by, in effect, Russian gas supplies filtered through Uzbekistan.
Well, this is good. Farruh, let me ask you then. There was recently this event in Kazan, the Future Games, and it was a chance for Russian President Vladimir Putin to meet with some of the few friends that he still has. And all the Central Asian presidents except the Turkmen president went. Now, given what John just said, is there symbolism in this? I mean, should we read? Can we read into this that this is a sign of Turkmenistan having bad relations with Russia?
I wouldn't say that they have bad relations, but a little soured relations because of this situation too. Like that, Russia is a strong army in Turkmenistan into giving up its capacities to export gas to China. If you remember last year, there were very rare case of Turkmen foreign ministry and Turkmen officials openly and blatantly saying that we will never join this gas union, and they were openly criticizing and contradicting Russian official statements angrily, saying that the Turkmenistan-China gas line belongs only to Turkmenistan, and no one has any right to even talk about it. So they were very angry, and from other political events inside Turkmenistan, political and social events inside Turkmenistan, we can see that Turkmenistan is also not very happy with Russia draining out its Turkmenistan's population. I mean, you know that in the recent years, thousands and tens of thousands of Turkmens, ethnic Turkmens for Turkmenistan, they were lured by this state resettlement program, and a lot of them permanently moved to Russia. And recently we saw that there were some developments or some noise about Russian language in Turkmenistan, and saying that we should use more of Turkmen. So, I mean, it doesn't have, these kind of things don't happen in Turkmenistan without direction from Arkadak and the presidential administration. So there is some strain in the relationship. And by the way, today I read in a Russian, the pro-Russian website, Central Asian website, that they're saying that the destabilization in Central Asia most likely will begin with Turkmenistan, because Turkmenistan is not part of ODKB, this collective security organization, and ODKB is helping Tajikistan to secure its border with Afghanistan. So Turkmenistan remains vulnerable to any threat coming from Afghanistan. So they are really trying to strong arm Turkmenistan into being a little softer towards Russia.
Okay, thank you. John, let me come back to you. And with Turkmen gas exports, there's a lot of things with them in Russia. And you mentioned, of course, that Russia is now exporting gas to Uzbekistan. None of this that never happened before. It was the other way. Uzbekistan used to export gas to Russia. Now Russia's exporting gas to Uzbekistan. It's exporting gas to Kazakhstan. These are potentially Turkmen gas markets too. So given that, and the fact that this gas is arriving via pipelines that once carried Central Asian gas to Russia, is this something of a poke in the eye for the Turkmen government? I mean, it surely must be wondering what happened, that the most easiest markets for them to sell to should have been the neighbors, and now they've had the rug pulled out from under their feet, so to speak.
Yeah, but this isn't the first time it's happened. It's a long time ago, 2009, Russia decided that it was importing too much gas from Turkmenistan. What had happened was that at a time when everybody was moving towards something like market-related prices, the Turkmen struck a very good deal to get close to a market price for their gas exports to Russia, which were then running at close to 40 BCM. So what did the Russians do when they realized just how much this was going to cost them, and that they didn't need to import all that gas in the first place? They simply told the Turkmens, you have got, I can't remember if it was 12 or 24 hours, to shut down the flow of gas. The Turkmens couldn't turn off the gas in that time, and the pipeline ruptured. A massive explosion, described by one Turkmen geologist as being like a vacuum bomb in the middle of the desert. Now that is a vicious piece of action by the Gazprom engineers or their political masters controlling the pipeline. And the subsequent negotiations, eventually, the Turkmens got an agreement that they would supply up to 30 BCM of gas to Russia. A good deal. Except that Russia never went above 10.5 or 11 BCM a year. In other words, the main export system collapsed at that point, and indeed it went way below 11 BCM. At one point there was virtually nothing going to Russia at all. So the Turkmens have no particular, shall we say, professional gas-related love or trust in Russia. The question is, for political reasons, do they feel that they need to continue having a gas relationship with Russia? And I think there the point is, you have a political structure in Turkmenistan that grew out of the Soviet system, and simply, disastrous though their relations may have been in the past, is more comfortable in dealing with other heirs to the Soviet system than in dealing with countries that never were part of the Soviet system.
Well, thank you. Okay, we're reached the midway point, so I want to remind that we're talking about Turkmenistan's recent push to sell its gas, and my guests are Farruh Yusupov, the director of RFERL's Turkmen service, known locally as Azatlyk, John Roberts, who is an energy security specialist with Methinks Limited, a consultancy specializing in interrelationship between energy, economic development, and politics, and is an advisor to the Trans-Caspian Resources Incorporated, a U.S. company seeking to develop a connector pipeline between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. Okay, John, let's follow up with what you were talking about before the midway point there. So we see now that Russian-Turkmen relations are certainly not good, aggravated, and Turkmenistan is really forced with its large reserves of gas to find new customers. How realistic are some of these other projects? And I'm going to start with selling to the West. I mean, where are they with that? It's been talked about for 3 decades, but now we hear Berdi Mukhomedov saying again recently, Papa Berdi Mukhomedov, that they've always been interested in selling gas to the West, and they just had this meeting in Antalya.
The meeting in Antalya is important. Now, I find myself crossing my fingers and saying all sorts of things like there have been many false starts before. So perhaps one shouldn't get too excited at this stage. All they have signed is a memorandum of understanding, and plenty of memoranda of understanding get signed that don't actually yield a finished product in the end. But I think there's something slightly different about this one. The first is the very fact that it was Gurbanguly Berdi Muhammadov himself, the architect, who presided over the Turkmen delegation in Antalya. Secondly, he was in face-to-face talks with President Erdogan of Turkey. And the Turks appear to be genuinely interested, if not determined, to secure gas from Turkmenistan. So let's just look at it from the Turkish perspective. Several things. They want to build Turkey into a hub. So Turkey gets gas from Russia, Turkey gets gas from Azerbaijan, it gets gas from Iran, and it gets LNG from a variety of suppliers. But a hunk of that, a really biggest hunk of that, comes from Russia. And they're not terribly happy about the sheer quantity of gas from Russia. They prefer it to be balanced by others. They don't want to end it, they're perfectly happy to receive it, but they want a more balanced portfolio. And their big hope was the new giant Sakarya field in the Black Sea, which was going to, they hoped in 3 or 4 years, account for roughly a quarter of their consumption. But that field is having problems. It is producing at less than 25%, I think, of what it was expected to produce. And we don't know when it'll overcome these teething problems. It is a new field. They do have teething problems, but these appear to be particularly severe. So therefore, importing gas from Turkmenistan creates a much more fluid variety of input to create a real hub. How do they get it, though? They've been looking at 2 ways in principle, according to the Turkmens. One is via Iran, and one is Trans-Caspian in some form via Azerbaijan. My understanding from the Turkish perspective is that they are not terribly keen on a route via Iran. In part, this reflects the fact that they've had problems in the receipt of their own gas from Iran in the past, and plenty of disputes. But perhaps the most important thing is Turkmenistan always said, we want to export gas to the West. We really do want to. But they did it as if they wanted to have a really big project, something like a 30 BCM a year system. What they've wound up talking about in Turkey seems to be getting gas to Turkey and then talking about it going, some gas going further onwards to Europe. But when it comes to volumes, they're talking of starting at as little a level as 2 BCM. Now, this seems to me to indicate that the Turkmens are now realistic, that they're beginning to understand that if they want to sell their gas to the West, they've got to think about doing it in the current commercial atmosphere And that atmosphere does not encourage vast expenditures on new infrastructure. They need to be using existing infrastructure as much as possible, which is why you look at either Iran, which has about 4 BCM of spare capacity through to Turkey, or Azerbaijan, which has a similar amount of spare capacity at the moment through to Azerbaijan. But one of the interesting things about Azerbaijan is that with the agreement that it reached with the European Union in the summer of 2022, the idea is that the southern gas corridor of the network of pipelines connecting Azerbaijan to Italy will rise in capacity at its narrowest point from 10 to 20 BCM. It'll be doubled. Now that is money that the EU is a project the EU is prepared to support, whereas it wouldn't support any expansion of pipeline systems through Iran. There is a hitch. I freely admit it. The hitch is, how do you get the gas from Turkmenistan to Azerbaijan? And that's where the project I've been acting as an advisor for comes in, which is that for a cost of perhaps as little as 500 million, $500 million, you could develop a 78-kilometer connection between production facilities on the Turkmen side of the Caspian and gas gathering facilities on the Azerbaijani side. So for a relatively small amount, you can start seeing a good start to a system. And if you start with a system and the rest of the system is going to be expanded, then you can look to expand your own volume of exports through it. So I suspect that is what the Turks are also looking at. Not just us. Whether we get involved, I have no idea. But the key bottom line is, it looks as if Turkey is pushing for a Trans-Caspian system, and it looks as if the Turkmens are at least listening. And perhaps one of the most important things is that amongst those present in the talks in Antalya was the foreign minister, Mr. Meredov. And last summer, quite unexpectedly, Meredov issued a statement. Foreign Ministry of Turkmenistan says there are no obstacles to sending gas westwards via Trans-Caspian route. So maybe the Turkmens are starting to think, how do we do this? What are the realistic options? What are the practical options? And if they involve starting relatively small, maybe that's what we should do.
Okay, thank you, Farruh. Let me ask you about this too. You know, at the end of 2022, in December 2022, the Azerbaijani and Turkish president showed up in Ashgabat, and they talked about this with President Serdar Berdimuhamedov, and I believe those were the last gas negotiations that Serdar was involved in. And after that, his dad took over, which many took to be a sign that his son was agreeing to a little bit more than Papa Berdimuhamedov was comfortable with. Now it seems like Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov is becoming closer, certainly to Turkey, but and also Azerbaijan, not in terms of gas, but symbolically. Following up on gas ties, he's now indicating that Turkmenistan might become a full member of the Organization of Turkic States at the same time. Are relations better between gas relations better between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan and Turkey than they were not a year and a half ago when the Turkish and Azerbaijani presidents were in Turkmenistan?
Yeah, at the moment, yes, because I mean, as we discussed earlier, because the relations are getting strained with Russia. Now Turkmenistan is showing that it can play with other partners too, and also this recent developments with TAPI, when Turkmenistan is now sending its specialists to Afghanistan. It also indicates that they want to show that they have many options, not only China or possible gas exports to Azerbaijan, Turkey, and the West, but different options. So yes, at the moment, this visit to Antalya by Berdimuhamedov the Senior, it was from his face, you could see that he was very happy, very pleased to be there, and very pleased. And even he was so heartened that he said that Turkmenistan will become part of the full member of Organization of Turkic States, which I don't think. I mean, he said that it would happen in 2024, which I'm not sure if he will honor his pledge and not behave like last time. Like he already promised full membership 2 or 3 times, and it never materialized. So, like, yes, at the moment he's he has more hopes in partnership with Turkey, but I mean, it can change overnight. You never know what comes to the mind of Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, and Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov is the, I mean, he is the eminent decision maker in Turkmenistan, especially when it comes to gas deals. He is now like in charge of this kind of negotiations of the gas and energy negotiations, and because gas defines Turkmenistan, the significance of Turkmenistan is in the gas. So he's leaving everything else to his son. Like, let him play. I will deal with the most important thing.
Okay, thank you. Before we leave the Caspian, because I also want to get on to TAPI a little bit here in a second too. But John, let me ask you first: is Turkmen government's policies on gas export still the same as it always was, where they have gas fields and pipelines that lead to their border, and they won't be involved in projects that we'll talk about TAPI in a second, but generally they won't be involved in the connection to their own domestic pipelines. That has to be somebody else, and they're not willing to spend money on their own money on a Trans-Caspian pipeline.
I'm not absolutely sure. I'll tell you why. For 20 years or more, in various forms, almost 30 years now, they've pushed for a pipeline to Pakistan and India. And there have been times when they have said they would contribute to the cost of developing the pipeline across Afghanistan. And there have been times when they have indicated about ownership of the gas flowing through the pipeline. So the old concept that the gas is sold at the Turkmen border and has nothing to do with Turkmenistan once it leaves Turkmenistan is not quite as strong. I think it's their instinctive attitude, but it may no longer be a dogma. So that's one point. Secondly, it's up against another dogma that is likely to be changed, which was Turkey always said, if you can get gas to the Turkish border, we will buy 16 BCM of gas for our own use and 14 BCM of gas that will ship through to Europe. But you've got to deliver it to our border. So between these two, you have got to reach a compromise. And both Erdogan and Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov will understand that very well. Secondly, you have Azerbaijan in the middle with modern infrastructure and developed infrastructure capable of carrying volumes of gas westwards into Turkey with just a small Trans-Caspian connector needed. And Aliyev has said he wouldn't pay for anything, but he would permit infrastructure to be used and make it available. In other words, what he's trying to say is, we'll be a good transit state, and Azerbaijan has always said it would be a good transit state, but we're not necessarily going to be giant partners in this. We don't want to be the driving force. The driving force for this has to be from Turkmenistan. And I think this is the consequence of many, many years of attempts by Azerbaijan to try to develop a Trans-Caspian supply. And one just ought to make one key point here. One of the reasons why Azerbaijan would like to have a regular supply from Turkmenistan is very simple. Its biggest gas field, Shah Deniz, is essentially contracted out for export at a time when Azerbaijan itself has a shortfall of gas for domestic use. Hence, you have a swap deal with Turkmenistan and Iran that brings in about a 1.5 BCM of gas a year, and you have a seasonal agreement with Russia for gas from Gazprom. There's a very good reason why they would want to have a regular supply going in, partly for their own use, and then partly also for onward delivery to Turkey, and even beyond Turkey, to Europe.
Okay, thank you. Let me just ask real quick, though. We were talking about President Ali of Azerbaijan. In 2018, he said that if Turkmenistan was serious about building a Trans-Caspian pipeline, then they should be serious about putting up their own money to do it. And he made a comparison to what SOCAR, the Azerbaijani state gas and oil company, has done with the Trans-Anatolian pipeline, and to say that we were an investor in that project, and now we're shipping gas into Turkey, and in fact, with the Trans-Adriatic, even into Europe. Do you think that message is starting to sink in with Turkmen officials, that maybe they need to come up with some of their own money to build some of these or finish some of these projects, build these pipelines?
I certainly hope so. SOCAR, the state oil company of Azerbaijan, produced a slide which I have repeated several times and shown at Turkmen conferences, that shows the extent of Azerbaijani involvement in everything, from the role in securing export sales contracts to the amount of money they've had to put in, not just in the TANAP project across Anatolia, but also in the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. Of the 20 billion, I think it's something like 18 billion of infrastructure to carry Shahtanese gas to export, I think I'm right in saying that Azerbaijan put in more money than anybody else, and that includes its biggest Western partner, BP. That is a major commitment. The key for Turkmenistan is not that this is going to cost it a lot of money. The whole point of any system that is likely to be developed is maximum use of existing infrastructure. But I do think that if they really want to get the project off the ground, then a willingness to state in principle they are prepared to contribute to investment would be incredibly helpful.
Okay, thank you. And now let's return to TAPI for a minute. Farruh, you just mentioned that I think possibly today the first Turkmen specialists from Turkmen Gas arrived in Afghanistan, and they're supposed to be posted there according to your service. They're doing 3-month shifts there. Is this a more serious effort? They're trying to get this done after 30 years. They're finally going to push to get TAPI through.
I think they would like to, but they don't have money. Of those specials that are being sent there, they're being paid $400 salary. Like average salary of those specialists is $400 a month, and that will be paid in manas by official rate, which will turn that $400 into less than $100. So, and they don't have money to do that, and I think the Turkmens very well know that they will not be able to accomplish this this project in near future. They just want to show. First, they want to appease Taliban, who visited Ashgabat recently. I mean, there are a lot of circumstances that. Taliban is pressuring Turkmenistan. This is like water usage, Koshtepe Canal, keeping the Afghan Turkmen border safe, all sorts of stuff. So the Taliban wants that project, and Turkmenistan now is just showing its goodwill, that it sincerely wants this project be completed and start using it so that everyone benefits from it. But they know that they don't have money, and paying $400 in Turkmen manas to your specialist is not something that will make anyone optimistic about the prospects of this project.
Okay, thanks. John, I want to ask you about about TAPI too, just real quickly. When the idea for TAPI came across, ironically, that it was when the Taliban were in power, and the general feeling was they keep stability in the country, so this project is possible. Now, the Taliban are still banned movement, but slowly international treatment or the international attitude to the Taliban is shifting. One can see that a day is coming when a lot of these sanctions and the status of the Taliban will be changed. Do you have any more optimism about TAPI ever being realized, given the recent events and with Turkmenistan sending its specialists than any time before, or is this still just a dream?
Not really. There are two big issues that would need to be solved. One, of course, is straightforward security in Afghanistan itself. And Afghanistan is the biggest section of the pipeline. And the second is, what is the market? India has, for many years, shown only token interest in the project. The interest that is shown tends to be Pakistan. But the key point is that what we've seen has been the soaring development of liquefied natural gas from the Gulf. Pakistan's issues with gas are still very, very severe. It would like to import more gas, but it doesn't automatically have to import it from Turkmenistan. Indeed, logically, it should be importing it from Iran. But somewhat curiously, the final leg of the Iran-Pakistan pipeline has still to be built. And remember, Iran has the world's biggest gas reserves. So I think we've got some key issues here that indicate, over and above what the Turkmens would like, TAPI remains problematic. And even if the Taliban secure a measure of acceptance, I'm not convinced that that will automatically lead to the construction of the TAPI pipeline.
Okay, thanks. We're running low on time, so I'm going to ask you both the same question. Are you optimistic about any of these potential new customers actually receiving any Turkmen gas in the near future? We got Turkey, we got Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and potentially Europe. Do you see any of these any projects to bring gas from Turkmen gas to any of these countries actually coming through anytime soon? And I'll start with you, Farruh.
I mean, it depends on Turkmenistan itself. It depends on how they can learn from their mistakes in the past. Like, for example, they've been exporting gas to Uzbekistan, and last year there was a big problem when the temperatures dropped to extreme levels in the region. They just failed. They couldn't deliver the gas to Uzbekistan because they couldn't clean the gas before putting it in the pipeline, and it froze. So there were so many mistakes and errors by Turkmens that it makes it look like they are not very reliable supplier of gas. So if they learn from their mistakes, yes, they could be Trans-Caspian and all the prospects delivering gas to Turkey will give them a lot of flexibility in diversifying its export routes. But it all depends on Turkmenistan, whether they are sustainable and consistent in their needs.
Okay, thank you. John, you get the last word. Will Turkmenistan have any new gas customers anytime soon?
I would say that the heavyweight element in all of this is Turkey. If Turkey really is determined to import gas from Turkmenistan, I don't see any real problem. Azerbaijan will happily cooperate. Georgia is obviously going to allow throughput. And I think also there's something else that's important. It looks as if, although there have been disputes in the past, that maybe Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan are beginning to sort of talk realistically about pricing of gas that would cross from Turkmenistan to Azerbaijan and then go through to Turkey. Maybe a bit early, but some indication of figures seem to indicate they're not that different from what the Russians are supplying Uzbekistan with. So under these circumstances, it looks as if they are sort of tentatively trying to push to something that is realistic rather than simply pursuing a dream. The one big thing that could change this dramatically would be if China, which is in the wonderful position from its perspective of being able to act as an arbiter as to whether it wants to get more gas from Russia or more gas from Turkmenistan, if China were to decide to put more money into building more infrastructure, notably the fourth line from Turkmenistan to China by Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, if that happens, then the Turkmens would no doubt be very pleased, but one would add they would not necessarily be getting international prices, whereas any gas that goes to Turkey is to a large extent going to be going at something like the prevailing international price.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, John and Farruh, for being on the program. And a big thank you, as always, to Nathan Shoemaker, our Majlis podcast producer in Washington, D.C. And a reminder, you can subscribe to the Majlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rferl.org. Thanks, and we'll be back again soon.